Okay, so benchmark fractions. I'm going to write underneath here, I'm going to just draw an arrow down, and I'm just going to write something real quick and easy. So I'm going to write, these are fractions that are very common. I'm going to write that they are easy to use. And then in parentheses there, I'm going to write add and subtract, because we're going to get to that potentially. They're friendly fractions. So instead of friendly numbers, they're friendly fractions. And I'll give you guys some time just to write those out. But again, as you're writing, you're really just thinking about fractions that pop up a lot. And again, it could be in a math class, it could be on a worksheet that you're doing, it could be on a test, or it could be out in the real world. In fact, I used fractions this morning as I made breakfast. And so I'll explain that here in just a second. So I'll let you guys get caught up. All right, next part, we're going to go underneath and we're going to write some examples. So I'm going to write EX for an example, and then I'm going to list some benchmark fractions that show up quite a bit. Now, when it comes to fractions, there are an endless amount of fractions out there. I mean, think about that. You can write a fraction for basically any number that there is on the number line. So, I mean, you're talking about just an endless amount of fractions. What we're going to focus on today is we're going to mainly focus on the ones that are again, considered to be benchmarks. And so we're going to start with probably some of the most common ones that you see out there are going to be your fourths. So I'm going to start with just 1/4. Now, the reality behind 1/4, why it's a benchmark fraction, is because 1/4, and you are going to think, gosh, he's repeating himself, but this is how it is out in the real world. 1/4 is the same thing as a quarter. So if you've ever heard like a quarter of an inch before, like sometimes, and y'all can write that underneath, sometimes like if you get some rain and you're watching the news and they're saying, oh, well, Lindale got a quarter of an inch of rain. Well, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about 1/4. 1/4 is a quarter. So there's one. The next one would actually be 2/4, which we should know and you should know as a half, or in the real world, 50 cents. So a half is half a dollar is 50 cents. So you could write that either way. The next fourth would be 3/4. 3/4 would be 3/4, or you could think of it as 75 cents. So your fourths are very common. Now your next fourth would be 4/4, which if you should know anything about fractions, which we're going to get to later this week, anytime the numerator and denominator are the same, that is a whole. That is a whole number. So I'm not going to write 4/4, but those are pretty common. So your fourths are pretty common. The next one that I think will be very common for you, you may not see this one as much, but this could definitely be a benchmark fraction, would be your thirds. So 1/3 is definitely a benchmark fraction. 2/3 is another benchmark fraction. I'm not going to write 3/3 because 3/3 would be our whole again, but thirds are usually very common. So 1/3 and 2/3 are going to be considered to be benchmark fractions. All right, and then I'm going to write another group of benchmark fractions. Again, there's not going to be just a ton here that we're going to work with. But I also feel like this is something that pops up a lot, and I've already used one on the page earlier, and those are fifths. So I'm going to write 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, and 4/5. These are some that aren't going to be as common as the ones above it, but they will show up quite a bit. So fifths could be considered benchmark fractions. All right, and so as you write this, I'll just tell you how I used benchmark fractions this morning. So I was making breakfast, and as I was making breakfast, one of the things that I was making some gravy. And so the gravy was just instant gravy, which means you cook it really fast. It's not anything made from scratch. So the instant gravy was calling for 1/2 cup of cool water. And so I had to go get a measuring cup. And on the measuring cup, one of the things that I noticed on it was broken down into benchmark fractions. Because if you've ever helped cook, if you've helped mom or dad or grandma or whoever cook before, a lot of cooking involves fractions, especially baking. So if you like baking cakes or cookies, things like that, you really start seeing fractions with that. Well, the fractions that you see are usually benchmark fractions. So like I had to go and I had to fill up my measuring cup with 1/2. Well, I noticed on the measuring cup it had fourths on one side, which is where I found my 1/2. But on the other side of the measuring cup, it had thirds. So it had like 1/3 and 2/3 and so on. And so, again, it kind of goes back to what benchmark fractions are. They are fractions that are very common. And cooking's not the only place that you're going to see them out in the real world. There's lots of different examples. There's one that sometimes kids don't think about too often, but I know I see this occasionally, and that's in games. Like if you're playing a game and you're like on this, and I'm not referring to board games here. I'm talking about, video games, things like that. If you're on like a story mode on your game and maybe there's like a progress bar on how much you have finished, a lot of times that progress bar is a benchmark fraction. Oh, you're halfway through the game, or you're 3/4 of the way through the game. And so just something different to think about, but that's usually where they pop up. Okay, one last little part of our notes. I'm going to flip the page because I'm at the bottom of mine. So you can do this as well, or you can do this on the bottom of your page. But I'm going to write on the back here. So one of the things that you're going to see on your activity is you guys are going to do an activity based off of less than 1/2, equal to 1/2, or greater than 1/2. And so it's going to be one of those things where you're going to have to be really careful. You're going to have to pay attention. And I might leave another video as part of the assignment. So you can look at this or take good notes with me. But then you can also watch that other video if you need some help. Okay, so real quick, we're just going to talk about less than 1/2, greater than 1/2, or equal to 1/2. So I'm going to write that on this page, so copy with me. So let's write less than, and then put 1/2, and then I'm going to kind of make this into a table here. So I'm going to put some squiggly lines, and then almost looks like a chart. In the middle, we're going to write equal to 1/2. And then on the right side, we're going to write greater than 1/2. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to practice, since halves are probably your most common benchmark fraction. Like we're going to see the fraction 1/2 a ton, and it's going to pop up a lot. So you need to be ready for that. One of the things that we're going to work on though is, and this to me is really important that students know this. We're going to work on, when we see fractions, what can we, what can we tell about that fraction? What do we know about that fraction? Meaning, it's kind of like, I've told you guys this in class a lot, so if you pay attention, you've heard this. when you are working a problem, sometimes it's good to think first. Think before you pick up a pencil. Think about that number. Think about that fraction. Well, what do you know about that fraction before you do anything with it? So we're going to practice here a little bit. And so this is going to be very, very similar to your activity. And so I'm not going to do a ton here, but I just want to do this with you guys and have a few in your notes. So I'm going to write some fractions on the side over here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put them into the category of less than a half, equal to a half, or it's greater than a half. So just copy these fractions with me. So let's write 5/8. I'm going to separate these with a comma. Let's do 6/12. Let's do 3/5. And let's do 9/12. Okay. I only want to do 4 of these because, again, you're going to see this on an activity. All right, so we have 4 fractions. Let's start with the fraction 5/8. Well, my conversation I would have with you is, well, what do we know about 5/8? Well, I would hope by 5th grade you would know that 5/8 is a little bit bigger than a half. And here's how you should know this. If you look at eighths, the half would be 4/8 because half of 8 is 4. So 4/8 technically would go in this middle column here because it's equal to a half. Well, we're dealing with 5/8 and it's just a little bit bigger. And so we're going to put it into the column greater than a half. So that wasn't too bad. The next one, what do we know about 6/12? Again, by 5th grade, you've done enough with fractions the last few years that when you look at 6/12, you ought to go, okay, well, half of 12, this goes back to your math facts, really. Half of 12 is 6, or 6 times 2 is 12. So that's going to go under the column of equal to. It's the same thing. Okay, let's go to 3/5. All right, well, what do we know about 3/5? Okay, this gets a little bit harder, in my opinion. And the reason it gets harder here is because most of the time when you're dealing with fractions, if you have an even number in the denominator, like this one had 8 and this one had 12, those are a little bit easier to work in your head and kind of think about, okay, well, what does that mean? Is it going to be greater than a half or equal to? When you get an odd number, it's a little bit trickier. And so I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. And I hope you can pick up on this because this is how I learned it. I'm going to think of this as, okay, well, 3/5. Since it's fifths, I could relate it back to money. And you hear me out here. This will make sense if you know your money. So if I had $5, half of $5 is $2.50. Well, that tells me if this is 3/5, 3 is greater than $2.50. So 3/5 is a little bit greater than a half. And again, that's a little bit harder to see. It's not as easy to work with, but if you understand money, which by 5th grade you should, then that's not going to be too bad. Okay, we have one more on the page. We've got 9/12. Well, this is interesting because we've already done 6/12. 6/12 we called equal to a half. Well, 9/12 it's got to be greater because 9's greater than 6. So 9/12 would come over here. All right, I lied. I said we're going to do 4. We're going to actually do 5 because I goofed. I didn't put one on here for less than a half. So let's talk about one that's less than a half. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do 4/10. Okay, well, let's talk about 4/10 and what we know about 4/10. 4/10. So 4/10 would be kind of like me going, well, okay, if it's tenths, half of 10 is 5. That would be equal to 5/10 would be equal to a half. Well, this is 4/10, so it's just a little bit, but it is less. So I'm going to put it in this column of 4/10. And now I know it's kind of like this. Now, even though these fractions here didn't look like benchmark fractions, I used a benchmark fraction to place them into a category to help me better understand them. So I think knowing if a fraction is less than a half, equal to a half, or greater than a half is going to do you a lot of good in the next few years. And most kids that know fractions really well, this is not that hard of an activity or hard of a skill. But I think it goes back to, what do you know about fractions from the previous years? You got to know, when you're writing that fraction, whatever the fraction is, you got to know it's a part or it's a piece. So probably the biggest thing on your notes today is you got to know that it's part of a whole. It is part, it's a piece. So that's very, very important. This skill here is going to be important to you, and you're going to get better at it as we go throughout the year. So that's what we're going to practice today. And so this is going to kind of conclude the notes. And after this, you guys will go on to an activity, and your activity will be very, very close to what we just got through doing. So I'm going to put another little video up. It's not going to be as long, but watch that second video if you need some help. Also, really pay attention to the activity on ClassKit, because it's going to be a little bit different. So I might leave you some notes on that, like the instructions on how to do it. I might leave you an audio message. If I leave you an audio message, listen to it and pay attention to the instructions. All right, miss you guys, and hopefully this assignment won't be too bad.